everyone. Welcome to another episode of SketchUp Bytes. Today we're going to be talking about how you can create your tabletop animations in SketchUp and render these frames out in V-Ray and eventually create a movie off the tabletop animation using a simple tool that comes installed with every Windows machine. It's essentially the Microsoft video editor that you can use in order to animate these image sequences. Okay, so let's get started. I have a SketchUp model of these chess pieces that I modeled a long time ago. And as you can see, they're set up right in the middle of the chessboard. And that's the origin where we're going to be sort of revolving around when we create this tabletop animation. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I need to figure out a way to place the camera so it's always facing that origin. So essentially the camera is going to be revolving around. So you might already guess I'm going to create a circle and place those cameras at those in the circumference of the circle so that it points towards the origin. But in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the circle tool, but instead of it having 24 sides, what I'll do is I'll type in, say, maybe 8S and hit enter. So I have an octagon, right? So from the center, I'm going to tap the up arrow key. So the circle is always going to be, facing up, or the octagon is going to be facing up. So now I'm going to click and drag, and notice I'm dragging along the red axis here. I can always drag it on the green axis. I just recommend that you always do that, so in the future when you need to edit anything about the circle or the multifaceted object, it's easier for you to do so, right? So for the sake of this example, I'm just going to pull it all the way up to this end here, and I have that plane that's drawn in. So now I'm going to select that plane, right? And I'm going to go into camera, standard views in front. As you can see, I have a shortcut assigned to that front view. I recommend you assign shortcuts to the different views that you might always cycle through. So in this case, I'm going to tap Shift F and then a V for parallel projection. And you can see I have that surface right there. Again, front view. And I'm going to move it up, in the blue direction, right? So I know exactly where I want the camera height to be. So let's assume that that's the camera height that I want. That's going to be focusing or looking down upon these night pieces, right? And that's what I'm going to use as my base. Okay, so I'm going to go back into perspective, and I don't need the face of this octagon, so I'm going to delete that face from there so I only have the outline of the octagon. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the position camera tool. So you might be familiar with the position camera tool. I have another video that I've created to show you exactly how to position your camera in your SketchUp model and create scenes. But in this case, I'm going to select that tool, right, and select the edge, this particular corner of that octagon, and I'm going to click and drag and point towards I'm just going to zoom in and sort of point towards the origin right there. So I have this one view that's created from that corner in the octagon. And what I'm going to do is view, animation, and add this as scene, right? I'm going to save this as a new style, why not? Right, so this scene has been created. Now I need to do the same thing around the corners of the octagon, right? I again take the particular position camera tool, again snap to that corner of the octagon and click and drag, and again zoom in so I'm pointing exactly to that origin right there. So that's going to be my next scene, right? So I'm going to do again view, animation, add scene. So now you can see, like, right, I already have this one scene. It's going to go to the next scene, and I'm going to do the same thing for the third time here. Take that position camera tool, snap to that corner of the octagon, and then again zoom in and make sure that I'm pointing towards that particular corner there. And then again view, uh, animation, and then add this as a scene. I have the shadows turned on here. My recommendation is to leave the shadows actually turned off. right? When you create your scenes, because in V-Ray, obviously we're going to be adding the lights, and the lights are obviously going to be casting the shadows exactly the way it's supposed to be, right? So there's no need to have the shadows on there, because what you'll notice is as soon as you have the shadows on, when you cycle through these scenes, the shadow turns off and then turns back on. The shadow turns off and then turns back on, right? Because SketchUp is taking its time to render out the shadows for this model. Right, so I've gone through the process and done that in this separate model over here. So you can see if I start off from scene 1, I go into scene 2, scene 3, scene 4, scene 5, and so on, right? So I've created 9 different scenes for this model where it's kind of circling around those knights and creating that tabletop animation for me. I can always go into view animation and play, so I get to see the animation before I actually render it out. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop this real quick and talk about how to set this up in V-Ray Next, right? Not the product V-Ray Next, but how to set this up next in a V-Ray 5 that comes with SketchUp Studio. Right, so I'm going to go into the asset editor here and open up V-Ray's asset editor. So I've added all the materials to the objects here, so I'm good to go. But I want to focus on the settings for the rendering. What I want to do is I want to make sure that, obviously after I set up all of the properties for your render outputs, in that the size of the render output and whether you want to see the safe frame here or not, I could toggle this on or off. The safe frame is going to stay or disappear. But what I'm interested in is the animation bit here. By default, it comes in toggled off, but you will want to toggle this on. And then it also gives you a few options. Do you want to do a particular frame range? Because going from scene 1 to scene 2 to scene 3, SketchUp will, render out, or V-Ray will render out 27 or 30, I forget, the number of frames going from one scene to the other, right? And so it totals out for 9 scenes here, it totals out how many frames it's going to render. So 0 to 240. So divide that by 9. That's the amount of frames per scene that V-Ray is going to render out. Or you can also, rather than doing a frame range, you can also do an entire animation as well. So whatever animations are included, or whatever scenes are included in the SketchUp animation, it's going to render that out. So I'm going to set this up as an entire animation. But what I also want to do is I have the render output set up properly. I'm going to look at the camera here, and it's a standard camera. The exposure value is set as a default. You can change this if you want to. I've also set up a depth of field and made sure that it's a fixed point. So I basically took that point and pointed towards the origin. So V-Ray would focus on that side of things, right? It would focus on the origin, and after a certain distance, it's going to defocus. So there's a little bit of a blurriness around the rendering that we're going to see in a few moments. But that's all that one needs to really set up, right? Once you set the render output, and then set it up to animation, then it's just a matter of you going in and hitting that render button right there. Like, so when you hit that render button, what's going to happen is, this isn't the rendering that I just did. So let's let that stay there. So it's going to go through each individual scene and start tabulating how many frames it needs to render, and it's going to start rendering things out for us. So it's going to take a couple of hours, right, for it to render on my machine. So we're going to come back and see what we get, right? So I'm going to stop the rendering process here. And another thing to keep in mind also is that, you have a render output. You want to save it at a particular location, right? You want to specify what that location is. And I've specified that location. So all of the, images for each frame get rendered out and are saved at that particular location, right? So we want to make sure that under the render output dropdown, right below effects, right below depth of field, there's a render output. And once you set up, the aspect ratio of the rendering. You also want to provide a path to where you want to save the rendered output as well. Okay, once that's done, you will have all of those images show up in your in that folder, right? And so that folder is right here, and this is where you will see everything on there, all of those images on there. But what do you do next? How can you actually compile these images into a video? The way to do that is use Microsoft's video editor, right? So the video editor app is the one that would use in a Windows machine. You can always use, some other image processing software that compiles images into videos, but this one comes installed with Windows, so I typically use this if I want to create any type of a video from a sequence of images. So I have it open here. I've created a project called Tabletop Animation and basically added all of the images that were rendered out. So what one needs to do now is essentially I'm going to do a Control A and select all of these images and place this in the storyboard so that it shows up in the storyboard, right? So I'm going to place it in the storyboard. And so, the Microsoft Video Editor is going to place it in the storyboard. But what it also says is it says 3 on here, 3 on each individual image. So what that means is that Microsoft Video Editor is going to stay on this individual image for 3 seconds and then move on to that image and that image and that image and so forth. So the whole animation is going to be about 12 minutes long. And that's not what we want, right? We want this to be somewhat of a smooth flowing experience, right? So what I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to click on that first image over here and do a Control A, right? So it selects everything, right? And then what I want to do is I want to change the duration. So how long should this particular image appear? Instead of 3 seconds, I'm going to just leave it as 0.5 seconds in this case, right? Actually, I need to let's actually do the duration right here because it only changed for one. So I wanted to change for all, right? So I'm going to do 0.5 and hit enter. So every image on here stays for 0.5 seconds, and now the animation is 2 minutes long. And we can get to see, what it would look like. We still see that it's a, stop and go type of an animation, and that's not what we want, right? So I'm going to again pause this, go back to the beginning. All right, let's drag this over to the beginning. Instead of it being 0.5, again, under duration, I'm going to set this to 0.1 and hit enter. And now it's a 24-second animation, right? So we get to see, somewhat of a smooth experience here when it comes to how this animation goes. Right, and I can add some custom audio, I can add some background music, and I'm going to go ahead and do that, and you're going to see the final product in a second as well. Okay, one thing that I do want to mention is, let me just go back to the SketchUp model here. If I do a view animation and play, what you're going to notice is that it's going to animate through the model fine, but you'll see the edges of the board kind of jumping up and down. So essentially, it looks as though the camera is jumping up and down. That's because I only have in this octagon that I created, I only have 8 vantage points, or in this case 9 because I come back to where I begun. So the more locations on that circle or this octagon that you place your camera, the smoother the tabletop animation is going to be. Right now, it seems like it's jumping, 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 jumping. If you look at the edges of the chessboard here, it looks as though that the camera is jumping up and down, but it's because we only have 8 vantage points in that octagon. If you had a circle, say, and you place your camera at 24 different points in that circle, pointing towards the origin, then you would have a much smoother animation. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to compile the video. Essentially, once I place the music in, it's just a matter of finishing the video and the video is going to be available for you to use. Okay. So hopefully that helped. Let me just recap here real quick. All we did was, in the SketchUp model, we basically made sure that, we wanted to figure out a location in the model that we wanted our camera to point to. In this case, I decided that it would be the origin here, right? So that it's sort of centered on the chessboard as well. And then I used the circle tool, define the number of sides in the circle. In this case, 8. I could have just as easily used the polygon tool as well, but I just used the circle tool to give you an example of how you can actually change the number of sides on the fly as well. And I drew that octagon, made sure I placed it at a height that I wanted the camera to be looking down from, and then used the position camera tool to find a corner, click and drag to where I want the camera to be looking at. And then once that view was determined, I essentially went in and added that as a scene. Okay, once that scene was created in V-Ray, I made sure to, under the settings here, I made sure that the animation was turned on. And in this case, instead of a frame range, I set the entire animation so it would run through all of the scenes that were created and create our set of images for us that we can then compile using Microsoft's video editor to create that tabletop animation for us. Okay, I hope that was helpful. Let me know if there are any other questions, but I'll be creating some more additional videos that might be helpful for you. Thank you.